pursue an IEP or a 504 is, how is it impacting my child's education? Like, are they unable, and the key word here is access, are they unable to access some part of their education? And it doesn't mean it's just academics. Like, a kid could have straight A's, but this is an example I give sometimes, but they could be depressed, and they're not socializing or making connections with their peers and teachers. And so even though they have straight A's, uh, they're not accessing the social emotional aspect of school, and therefore they require a service or accommodation to help them access that. So the question I have for Shauna, I think, is, how is this impacting your child's education? Like you mentioned, he might go, transitions are difficult. So is that preventing him from accessing some of the material, or is it preventing him from building connections with peers? Like, because that's what the school is going to say. Like, how is this in any way impacting his education? And if it isn't, then no, it's not a good you're not going to have a solid footing to stand on if you request an IEP. You might be able to get some type of accommodation plan that's, and I'm speaking from, United States kind of terminology here, but accessing the IEP is, it's a legal document. And so you want to come at it like almost like a lawyer for your child and say, like, because he is not able to arrive at class on time, he misses the warm up and he feels bad about himself, and he's struggling to connect with his peers, and kind of try to document that. And if you feel like for some reason he is not accessing some part of his education, the most important step you can take is just telling the teacher or telling the principal and saying, hey, I'm noticing this. I'd like to request a formal assessment to evaluate if this is preventing him from accessing some part of his education. And so there's lots of templates out there. The tool that I'm going to share at the end, and I put in the comments, gives you the actual language you can use to request that assessment. But if you're concerned about it, I always think it's good to assess, and an assessment doesn't have to be this massive process. It could be a conversation with the school. You guys come up with an agreed upon assessment plan. In the United States, they're required, if you make that request in writing, they're required to come up with a plan and present it to you within 15 school days. So that's important to know, is that you have a lot of rights in this process. And I would say it's better to request and get denied than to not request at all and then wait a few years and then the problem grows. So those are my thoughts on it.
Okay. And in Ontario, sorry, that's really helpful, Sean. I like how you said it's like you're being a lawyer and you're advocating for your child, right? And I think that's an important thing, that we want to work together, parents and teachers. We want to work together to support your child as best as we can. And parents, you are the expert on your child. You know them best. So a teacher in the classroom has, could have 30 kids with 30 different kinds of needs. They're not necessarily the expert on your child. They can share their observations, they can share assessments, but you are the expert on your child. So you want to bring the information and the knowledge that you have to the team and work collaboratively together with the school. That's always what's best for the students, when students, teachers, and parents are working together. And it's good to bring in the special education teacher then, because those teachers have the extra training, the extra experience. They can bring in some different resources and perspectives. In Ontario, generally what happens is, either parents are noticing difficulties or teachers are noticing difficulties. And the first step that we might take after teachers and parents connect together is we would go to something that's called a school team meeting. And that's a meeting with the teacher, the special education teacher, and often a principal or vice principal is present. And it's like a brainstorming session. So the teacher would share the observations that are happening in class, and they would together brainstorm some ideas, some supports that can be put in place to support the student. And then the teacher or the special education teacher would contact the parents and share what happened at that meeting. Then the next step would be to go to a school resource team meeting. And this is the type of meeting that Sean mentioned where you could request an IEP. In Ontario, in order to put an IEP in place, there could be an identification. So your child may go to an IPRC committee to have an identification, such as a learning disability. So we know if ADHD often does not travel alone. There's often other things that go with ADHD, like learning disabilities or anxiety. So if there is an identification, then the child automatically would have an IEP. But sometimes there isn't an identification. So ADHD alone doesn't qualify for an identification in the board that I'm in. So this is where, parents might be wanting to advocate for that IEP. We can still put an IEP in place because we want children to be successful at school. We want supports in place to help them be successful. The best thing that you can do is share, like Sean was talking about the assessments, any kind of assessments that you have, if you can share that with the school, that is really beneficial because on an IEP, um, the first part is, where the assessments are. The assessments are shared at the top of the IEP. So if you have a full educational, psychoeducational assessment, that's helpful. Some families might have OT assessments or speech assessments. And then there's a section on the IEP that lists the strengths, the student's strengths, and what their needs are. And then after that, there's accommodations. So there might be instructional accommodations, assessment accommodations, environmental accommodations. But all of that is really based on the assessment data. So like Sean was saying, you have to be a lawyer, present all your data. The more data that we have, the more evidence we have, and especially from professionals like that you might have involved, like psychologists or speech therapists or occupational therapists, the better it is. Teachers want to be implementing all those strategies, but we're not psychologists and speech therapists and occupational therapists. So we need that input from the experts.
Yeah, and like I wanted to add a couple of things that I was thinking about as you were sharing. I was thinking about like the biggest mistakes parents make in this process. So like one is they don't want to appear confrontational. So they're like, oh, this teacher's really nice. They're always nice to my kids, so I shouldn't bring this up because I don't want them to, retaliate against me, or that I don't want them to stop liking my kid. But the truth is, if your kid is struggling or they're not succeeding in some class and you keep having to ask the teacher, like, how can they do this or what can they do differently? That's putting a lot of pressure on the teacher that it's probably a sign that your child needs a different support. I mean, they could probably still be in the class, but maybe they just need a resource class to help break down those directions into smaller pieces. So oftentimes when you bring up your issue as a parent and you request, a resource meeting or a student team meeting, that takes the pressure off the teacher and puts it into the hands of the administration and the special education department so that they can assign the right people to work with your kid for those particular needs. So just remember, like if you're scared to confront or address this to a teacher because you don't want them to be upset or feel, pushed away, this is probably actually helping them do their job more effectively because now it's giving them the resources. And the other thing that mistake parents make is they don't realize that they have the right to what's called an IEE. And an IEE is an independent educational evaluation. And while the school can perform the evaluation on your child, sometimes parents prefer to have it done by an objective third party because it's not connected with the school, and sometimes there's history or reasons why the school might not assess objectively, unfortunately. And so just remember, you also have that right to request an independent educational evaluation. And it's just a very basic template. You just say why you're requesting it, you make the request, and the school is required to respond to you within a certain number of days to either approve your request or deny it with a basis for denying it. So it's good to know your rights in that aspect.
I'm not sure how that is in Canada. In Canada, I think the assessment you're talking about, we would call a psychoeducational assessment, which is available through the schools.
Right.
There's often a wait list. It could be up to a 2-year wait list, and that would have to go to the SRT meeting. And at that meeting, the team would have to agree that that would be the next step, and there'd have to be evidence that would support that that's the next best step. But yes, a lot of families in Canada as well do choose to go the private route.
Right. Well, and that's interesting. 2-year wait list sounds excruciating for a parent who's struggling. In the US, once the assessment plan is agreed upon, there has to be an assessment completed within 60 days of the agreed upon assessment plan, I believe, is the deadline. So the schools are really held to a, I call it, I liked how it was put, parents have disproportionate rights in the process, meaning they have a lot of power. But unfortunately, a lot of parents don't know but if you do know that and you're aware of that, it really gives you a strong kind of, position to support your child without having to wait amounts of time that could result in learning loss. 2 years could be, if it took 2 years to identify, the issue, that could be really damaging to a child.